Hi guys, and welcome back to The Discerning Gamer. Sorry for a period of radio silence from the channel. I'm working on a house renovation at the moment and it's been taking up a lot of my time and energy. I'm going to do a little channel update at the end of the video, so stick around if you're interested to see what's coming up for the future of the channel. Anyway, back to the matter at hand. The observant amongst you will see that this is the Battletech Backer Beta that we're looking at. Besides giving you a look at some gameplay, I wanted to talk about why I backed the game, my hopes for it at release, and also my impressions from my time with the beta. So, if you haven't paid any notice to the game thus far, it's a turn-based tactics game built in the Battletech universe that many of you will know from the MechWarrior games. The lore of the universe sees humanity spread among the stars and ruled over by warring feudal factions, experiencing a technological backslide. This makes the mechs at the core of the game incredibly valuable treasures that are able to turn the tides of wars, and the mech warriors who pilot them, badass hotshots. The single player portion of the game puts you in control of a mercenary company of mech warriors with its own starship embroiled in the politics between the ruling houses. This also makes up the second portion of the game, aside from the turn-based tactics of combat. It's a mech design and management metagame. I think the metagame could give crucial context and weight to the combat phases of the game, particularly in the single player, but we'll come to that in a moment, as is really all for naught if the action isn't right. So, the turn-based combat in MechWarrior is both familiar, but has some other interesting twists to it, and is generally quite well thought out, I would say. It works on an I go, you go kind of system, where combat is broken down into 5 initiative phases, which you can see at the top of the screen. So broadly speaking, the heavier a mech is in terms of its tonnage, its size, the later it goes in the phase order, so 5 being the earliest and 1 being the least, though that can be modified by quirks of the pilot or mech warrior that you've chosen to jockey that mech for you in the match. So once you've got a mech that can move in a initiative phase, you can either get them to hold their move so that you can move all of your mechs in one concentrated effort in a lower initiative phase, or you can actually do something with them in the phase that they first become available. So you generally move and shoot or move and perform some action with your mech, and then an enemy who has an available mech, if they have an available mech in that phase, can then move one of their mechs and shoot it, etc., and then you'll go back to yours and so on. I'm not sure how it decides whether if you or your enemy gets to go first, maybe it's further broken down by weight class. So say you've got 2 light mechs which might weigh, I don't know, between 20 and 30 tons. If I've got a 25 ton and theirs is a 30 ton and they can both go in phase 5, then maybe my 25 ton mech goes faster. That would make sense to me, but it might be a bit more arbitrary than that. But what this means is that actually there's a really nice flowing back and forth to the combat where you're never really waiting too long between your turns, and you've got a constant stream of new information and a changing battlefield to react to. And I think also when you're playing against other human players, it means that there's a bit of scope for mind games, because you can kind of force them into perhaps making a rash decision with one mech rather than having to move all of your forces and then leaving them to move all of their forces to counter that. So it works quite well, I'd say. It's a pretty elegant system. And when you're actually in control of your mech, you generally have it split into 2 phases, a move and an action phase. So that can actually be taken up, for example, if you sprint, that can take up your entire turn, but give you extra movement range, and it can also impart things on you like the evasive bonus, which makes you harder to hit for enemy units. Likewise, you could do a regular move but forego your shooting opportunity to brace for incoming fire, and make sure your mech takes less damage or regains some of its stability, or perhaps allows its weapons to cool down in the intervening period. And this is where we really get into the difference between Battletech and something like XCOM, because it's all quite familiar if you've played most turn-based tactics games. Particularly, XCOM comes to mind as the poster child for the genre recently. But Battletech has its own kind of lore and flavour to go with that, and make changes to that formula because of the fact that obviously we're not running soldiers around here, we're running bipedal tanks. And so as a result of that, there are a lot of factors that you've got to take into account when deciding on your moves for any specific round. The first two obvious ones, which you can see on the bars that come up next to your mech warriors, is there is the health bar, which is broken down into armor and structure. So there is a certain amount of armor plating on all the different sections of your mech, which you can see broken down the left hand side, and those protect the components or the structure. Now, your mech could theoretically lose sections of its torso, both of its arms, one of its legs, and still continue functioning and fighting. However, if its cockpit, where the squishy little pilot's contained, or both of its legs, or its central torso, where its reactor is contained, are destroyed, then that's an instant kill. So it's not just this linear hit point drain to killing someone. There are actually ways to be tactical and smart about this. And a couple of those ways are underneath the health and armor bar, which is at the very top of the mech's status readout when you hover over them. There are two other bars which are heat and stability. So because these mechs are covered in all sorts of futuristic weapons like multiple missile launch blocks, lasers, autocannons, railguns, particle projectors, they generate an enormous amount of heat when they're fired. And as a result, if you continually fire without all of your weapons, or more than the heat sinks within your mech can cope with, then you can actually overheat your mech, leaving it to have to shut down for a turn and be completely unable to do anything, and actually leaving your enemy in a position where they can select specifically what they want to fire at and hit your weakest parts with you completely unable to do anything. Likewise, there is the stability bar, which kind of represents the how well braced for incoming fire your mech is. So if they're hit by a laser, it's really not going to affect their stability because it's just, focused light. But if they're hit by missiles or autocannon rounds or something like that, because it's a standing vehicle, it can actually be knocked off balance. So if you're clever about it and hit a large mech, for example, that you're not likely to be able to kill quickly, you could hit it with missile barrages in quick succession and knock it off stability and actually knock that mech down. And then any shots while it's lying on the ground, again, can be called or specifically targeted shots that allow you to target specific parts of it to destroy. And this is a tactical decision within itself, because obviously, you might be thinking, well, yeah, just target the cockpit, kill the pilot, target the center torso, get rid of it as quickly as possible. But when you're talking about really heavily armored thing that perhaps you haven't had the opportunity to lay into over the period of a whole match, you might think, actually, I'm just going to blow off the left arm because that's where his most dangerous weapon is. And I think this opens up a lot of room for really interesting tactical thinking and decision making. Not only that, but also in the way that you move and face your mechs, because if if your mech's braced or steady and it's not overheated, the enemy can't target more than basically which quadrant they're firing at it from. So is it full frontal, is it left arm, right arm, is it from behind? So the facing of your mech, much like the facing of a tank, can make a big difference as to where you're receiving fire from, which components are likely to be destroyed, and the overall survivability of your mech. And I think that not only does this play beautifully into the lore and later on the mini game, as I'll discuss, of kind of designing and managing your mechs in between battles, but it also adds a huge amount of tactical decision making and thought and room for sort of finesse and grace to the game, which I think could set it in really good stead to be a long running and successful game. And I think it's just great when a game actually takes the time or is designed thoughtfully enough that the mechanics all reinforce the lore or the ambience of the setting that the game finds itself in. Because it's great when you have really good mechanics, but it always to me seems a shame if they're kind of jackknifed in there or crowbarred into a design for the sake of making the design good. And of course we all want well designed games, but when it sort of doesn't make sense with what you're seeing, it's just not as elegant as it could be. Whereas this, everything about the turn-based tactics rules makes pretty good sense within the fact that we're actually controlling these bipedal tanks and the pilots within them. And this even goes as deep as to take into account the environment and the different planets that you're fighting on. So you can see in front of us we've got kind of a snowy environment where there's a river running through the middle of the map. And this ambient will mean that all mechs can fire their weapons more often because it's just generally cooler, so it's going to take longer for the mech to overheat. But also because there's a river, if you actually stand your mech in that river while they're firing, the water is going to help dissipate the built up heat from their heat sinks quicker and allow your mechs to fire more quickly. So I think that's interesting because it'll kind of inform your choices in the metagame as to what mechs you're going to bring. So if you're fighting on a desert world or an industrial world or one where there's like an open lava vein or something in the middle of the battlefield, bringing a mech that's covered in lasers is probably not going to be a great idea, because as soon as it fires it's going to be generating a huge amount of heat and then unable to dissipate it quickly because of the high ambient temperature of the battlefield that they're on. And I think that's a really interesting and great thing to have to take into advantage, and it's very rewarding for the player to kind of feel like they've made a smart decision at every course of it, and that they had a chance to influence the course of the battle and their chances of success even before they landed their units on the planet. Onto the metagame element of it now. This is something that Harebrained Schemes have given us some details of, but they've shown less of in their various press releases. In the single player, we'll command a mercenary mech warrior company with a central host of characters on a starship, and it follows a storyline through a politically tumultuous time in the galaxy, which is bringing all of the feudal houses that rule the human planets into conflict. From what's been said, though there is a central storyline to follow, there are lots of ways to progress through it and a lot of player choice depending on which of the houses you side with, who you piss off, and the results of key battles. This is something that they've stressed, is that though the mechs are very powerful, they're also very precious, and so if a mission is going tits up, then it's up to you to make a smart call and save a mech or a pilot who will have been gaining experience over the course of the whole game. However, this adds to another layer of decision making, because if you're on a contract and you only partially complete a mission or fail it in order to save your own skin, then whoever hired you is probably going to take a less than favourable opinion of you. And this could lead to some really tense moments in battles and really interesting consequences and twists and turns in your journey through the story. So I think there's a lot of scope for the metagame and these decisions to really make the campaign something that's got a lot of replayability and is very interesting and engaging from a kind of emergent story perspective. So also, as you earn money from your missions, you can use that not only to maintain and repair your current mechs, but of course you can buy new ones and modify your existing lineup in the mech lab, which is like the mech's hangar within your ship. If it's anything like other MechWarrior games, the Mech Lab can get pretty involved, allowing you to choose the disposition of armour across various parts of the mech, what weapons are mounted where, how your heat sinks and ammunition are stored in the mech, and even the size of the engines and the sensor packages on board. I think this could be a great element to tinker with, and it already has a nice flow with the rest of the game. I can see myself making tweaks, swapping different components, and comparing the combat effectiveness of what I've done in a battle, and then making refinements as you go. And of course that also builds a kind of connection and investment with the mech in the battle itself, because once you've spent all this extra money and time getting a mech just where you want it, to then see it blown to pieces is not something you want. And so there's going to be a lot of kind of emotional investment and drama to these fights as well, which I think is a very welcome sign. And not to mention just the levels of replayability that brings to the game in terms of trying, you know, different loadouts. Do you have all the heaviest mechs that you can bring out, or do you go for a light skirmisher force, or whatever? I think just the depth for tactical complexity there is very promising. And finally, I wanted to talk about a few things that aren't confirmed for the final product, but that I'd like to see. And one thing I think is I'd love to see proper characterizations as of the mech warriors. In the beta, they've got nice unit cards in the battle, and they've got fairly decent voiceover work, but my hope for the campaign at least is that there are a core of characters that are actually really well fleshed out, that have voice acting that you can interact with between missions, and that even perhaps open up new missions or options in the story depending on whether they are in your company or against you, whether they live or die. And that would add another great layer to the interaction between the metagame and the turn-based tactics itself, and a lot of replayability and interest to the story, I think. I could even imagine mech warriors that perhaps you don't recruit end up working for other factions and becoming nemesises through the campaign, and perhaps if you're unable to kill them at one juncture, they come back stronger or harbour a grudge or something along those lines. So my overall verdict of the beta is that it's polished, it's looking good, at least technically and mechanically, for a launch later this year. I've enjoyed it as a whole, and I don't want to pass balance on the judgments of the mechs just yet, but I will be interested to see how it's tweaked between now and release. Thanks for listening so far, guys. I'm interested to see whether you share my enthusiasm for MechWarrior and your hopes and concerns for the final game, so let me know about those in the comments below. On to a quick channel update. As I've mentioned, I've been working on renovating a barn for the past 4 or so months, which I'll actually be living in come July, which is very exciting. This is why my video releases have been sporadic, and I haven't really had the time or energy to focus on the channel as much as I'd like to. With that drawing to a close, though, I'll probably be able to do a quick tour of my new setup in the barn, which will be pretty swish, and establish a proper release schedule aiming for daily or semi-daily releases once I'm moved in. At present, I'm thinking I'll do a mix of shorter form content in the form of replay commentaries for strategy games, first-person recordings of me, that kind of thing. And because that stuff's easier to get out more regularly, in the background I'll work on some more thoughtful, heavily edited pieces like reviews, game design thoughts, or previews of upcoming games. The games I'm thinking of covering at least, when we're all set up, will be Steel Division, Squad, Dawn of War 3 and Rising Storm 2 as kind of my regular multiplayer favourites. And I'll also do some playthroughs of single player games, which will be probably quite heavily edited, so they won't just be uncut let's plays. They'll be kind of narrative, and I'll skip to the good bits and try and keep them kind of at like 10 minutes a shot or something like that, whilst actually getting through the game in a reasonable pace. You know, maybe 15-20 episodes or something for a whole game. And I'm thinking that would work quite well with games like Stalker, which I've been meaning to give a run through of for a while now. And also I'd like to start getting the audience involved some more, so that means you guys, you know, regular viewers can join in for discussions around games or some multiplayer matches that I can comment on. And if you'd like to be involved in that, please let me know in the comments down below. I'm also interested to see if there are any games you'd particularly like for me to cover that you think would fit well with, you know, my style, my interests, or just that you'd like to see me talk about. So let me know any recommendations of that down in the comments below, particularly as the Steam summer sales going on at the moment. So if you stuck around for the channel update, guys, I really appreciate it, and I really appreciate your patience in sticking with the channel thus far. And so without further ado, I've been the Discerning Gamer. Until next time.